You're listening to Something Real with Pastor Rich Zeiger, connecting the reality of God to the realities of life. On today's episode, we are staying in Luke and talking a bit more about how Jesus was kind of building his roster, or his team, if you will, of disciples. And we always talk about how that connects to our lives today, but with a unique sort of event happening in our community this week, we're kind of tying it into that as well. You'll see what we're talking about.
Welcome back. In our last Something to Think About episode, we saw Jesus being falsely accused of desecrating the Sabbath. And in the face of those accusations, Jesus remains focused on the reality of who he is and what he came to do. He made it clear to his accusers and to the rest of us that God's commands were given to enlighten us, not to enslave us. In the first 11 verses of chapter 6, we see that God values people over procedure, reality over ritual, and heart over habit. Today we see that the Lord also values teamwork, as Dr. Luke recounts Jesus naming the 12 men that will become his inner circle and his special messengers for the rest of his earthly ministry. Luke has spent the first 5.5 chapters in setup and exposition, establishing for his reader a context and an understanding of who Jesus is as the story unfolds. Having now established that foundation and having introduced the growing conflict with the religious leaders, the evangelist now gives what might be considered the apostolic roster as he prepares his readers for the rising action of the teaching and ministry of Christ. The names of the players will become important as the narrative advances, but for now it's enough to have the group named for us. We find the list in Luke 6, verses 12 to 16. It's only 5 verses, but there are some important observations we can make and conclusions we can draw. Before we even approach the text, we ought to remind ourselves of what we have already learned. Luke has established from the very first chapter that Jesus is both fully human and fully God. We have already seen that he is the promised Messiah, not only from his teachings and claims about himself, but by the proclamations of angels and the prophecies of God's faithful servants. He has already clearly demonstrated that he has power and authority over all creation in both the physical and spiritual realms. Knowing these things about Jesus, it is logical to conclude, and rather obvious, that Jesus was and is uniquely able to accomplish all he intends to do without help. In other words, Jesus doesn't need a team. He chooses one. He chooses one because he values relationships and teamwork. It's easy to observe this priority outside the book of Luke. Everything Jesus does is rooted in his eternal nature as God. From the dawn of creation, relationships and collaborative work have mattered to God, as we can clearly see from Genesis 2:18, when God says, "It is not good for the man to be alone. I will make a helper suitable for him." Throughout the scriptures, God moves through families, later through Israel, and eventually through the church. Here in the text, we read in verse 12 that before Jesus chooses the team, he spends the night in solitary, earnest prayer. Jesus is constantly devoting himself to focused conversation with the Father, drawing all of his strength and wisdom from that intimacy. How much more ought we, who are only human and not God, draw from that same well? Note also in verse 13 that Jesus chooses 12 from among the larger group of disciples and designates them apostles. A disciple is a learner, essentially an apprentice. Apostle, on the other hand, is a term meaning special messenger. Jesus has regularly demonstrated that he loves people without regard for class, ability, or position. Yet here he sets 12 apart for a unique role. The role, and even the unique friendship that accompanies it, does not change their value. All are equally valued and loved by God, but we do have different roles to play and different responsibilities that the Lord assigns to us. It is apparent that this team was not assembled based on abilities or qualities within themselves, but according to the Lord's sovereign choice. Human leadership principles would never have built this team. Who would choose for your inner ministry circle men of little education, men of bad reputation, a radical political dissident, and a traitor? Jesus picked his team deliberately after much prayer, and yet not for their efficiency or qualifications. He chose these 12 men not primarily to benefit his ministry, but to bring God glory. Our Lord puts a high priority on relationship and teamwork. He always has. When we live and work in harmony, we demonstrate God's character. As we engage others in meaningful relationships, we are able to reflect God's love through those relationships. As Real Life Community Church participates in our community's Civil War Days celebration, we recognize that our nation dealt with many of the same issues at that time as we do now. And we see principles at work in the Scriptures that we can apply. God created humans in His own image, all humans, regardless of background or skin color or any other superficial division we may come up with. May understanding that Jesus called His apostles as equals, regardless of their past or their social standing, remind us that all human beings are created equal and loved equally by the Creator. May that understanding move us to unity as we reflect God's character by loving and valuing all people equally. Thanks for listening, and I hope this has given you something to think about.
Thanks for listening. You can check out our shows on Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Sundays, and on pretty much any podcast platform you'd like, including YouTube. So be sure to join us 3 times a week. We look forward to it.